beat the waiver wire. It is time for my top waiver wire stashes ahead of week 9. You know the drill. Our goal here is to get ahead of the game and get a jump on your league mates. We are predicting players who could be the top waiver wire ads on Tuesday and snagging them now for free so that you don't have to spend your FAAB or waiver priority to get them. If you're new here, I'll give you an example. If you went to waivers at some point to grab a Rondé Gadsden and he was gone, your league mate that grabbed him might have seen this video series because we have been on that for weeks. So lock in with us. Let's talk about who we are stashing ahead of week 9. With Christian Kirk and Nico Collins ruled out, Jaylin Noel is both a stash and a potential streaming option for this week. Noel saw an uptick in snaps and targets over the past couple of weeks, with Christian Kirk dealing with a hamstring injury. Last week, he had his most productive outing of the season with 4 receptions on 7 targets for 77 yards against the tough Seattle defense. It is important to pay attention to this because his production is a clear development in his game and a sign of growing trust from the Houston coaching staff. Kirk was injured earlier in the season and missed weeks 1 and 2, and during that time period, Jaylin Noel had extremely low production in those outings. It is also important to note that this current hamstring injury is a re-injury from the same one that Kirk had earlier in the season. He didn't practice all week, meaning that he likely isn't close to playing and is in jeopardy of missing week 9. That makes Noel a viable streaming option in week 9, but there's also potential long-term value here. Christian Kirk's contract only runs through the 2025 season. The Texans don't have any long-term investment in him, and it's been a couple of years since we have seen any kind of consistent production from him in general. Kirk and Noel both play out of the slot, and the Texans would likely transition to Noel as their starting receiver in the slot next year. Considering that Noel should be their future, if he strings together a couple of strong performances in Kirk's absence, I would not be surprised if Noel simply pushes Kirk out of the way this season. You might be wondering why I said stash Jaylin Noel and not Jaden Higgins. That is because Higgins is a flex option for this week, not a stash candidate. If you need to add Higgins and play him this week, that is perfectly fine. He could potentially outperform Jaylin Noel this week. But the problem here in terms of a stash is that Nico Collins has a concussion, so more than likely he will clear concussion protocol and play in week 9. Higgins plays on the outside with Collins. Noel plays in the slot. The Texans' offensive line, it just hasn't been good enough, unfortunately, to allow enough time for CJ Stroud to make Higgins a reliable weekly flex option when Nico Collins is healthy. Stroud has a hard enough time as it is right now getting consistent volume to Collins, let alone Collins and Higgins. That is the only issue here. I have talked a ton about 2 backup running backs in particular that have potential standalone value here. It is Kyle Monangai and Brashard Smith. Now, everyone is in on Kyle Monangai. He is over 40% rostered in Yahoo leagues. If Monangai is still on your waivers, he is an absolute must-stash. But somehow, Brashard Smith is still less than 20% rostered, and that is way too low. His roster percentage should be on par with Monangai. Do not underestimate Brashard Smith's potential in the Chiefs' offense. Smith has had a minimum of 3 targets in each of the past 4 games, and when you look at the usage for Isaiah Pacheco, Kareem Hunt, and Brashard Smith over the past couple of weeks, I think we're seeing a clear shift. Hunt suffered an injury in week 7 and was in and out of the game, but we've got more than enough evidence to know that he is not involved in the passing game. Before that, in week 6, we saw a shift in terms of carries, more for Isaiah Pacheco. Do not be shocked if this backfield makes a clear shift back to relying on Pacheco for early down work and some passing down usage, with Brashard Smith as the supplemental change of pace back, receiving back. Brashard Smith had a fantastic week 7 performance, and while a ton of his carries did come in the 4th quarter in terms of garbage time, he was very involved in the first half of the game, particularly in the passing game. He had 5 receptions on 5 targets for 42 yards, his best receiving usage of the season. He is thriving. And Patrick Mahomes is dealing. He is pushing aggressive pace. He is consistently hitting a minimum of 30 pass attempts, and Smith appears to have a permanent role there. And we could be in line for another good game that would make him a top waiver wire add on Tuesday, because this matchup against Washington should lead to more garbage time production. Sometimes stashes aren't actually playing this week because they have a bye. With all the injuries and desperation starts this week and 6 teams on a bye, there's a good chance that Bam Knight or Michael Carter might be on waivers even in deeper leagues if someone was forced to drop them. We want to stash them for one very specific reason. They play Dallas in week 9, and that is a good reason to stash anyone. And this is a committee, so we have to talk about both. We'll talk about Bam Knight first, since as far as we know, he will be the lead back still. Knight had 14 carries for 57 yards and 3 receptions on 4 targets for 7 yards. He played 45% of snaps and scored 9 fantasy points. He's had between 9 and 12 fantasy points for each of the past 3 games, so he's got a fairly stable production, and 2 of those matchups are considered fairly decent defenses. Arizona has kept games fairly close, so regardless of who's at quarterback, there doesn't appear to be any real risk of game scripts being an issue for Knight. Now, Michael Carter still has value despite Knight technically being the lead back, because to be fair, we can't actually trust Arizona from that aspect, but the lead back anyway, that is a bit misleading because it's really just a committee with a slight edge towards Knight. In week 7, Carter had 7 carries for 11 yards and 2 receptions for 25 yards. He played 37% of snaps. Again, Knight is the preferred option here, but because this is a game against Dallas, who is giving up the 6th most fantasy points to opposing running backs, Carter would also have low-end flex value. And if you want to use them, you do want to stash them rather than spending any FAAB on Tuesday to get them, because after this game, we could see Trey Benson return. You guys know that I am loyal to Wan'Dale Robinson, and I do believe he is the wide receiver that you want to roster for the Giants. However, you also know that I really believe in Jackson Dart, and he can absolutely provide additional fantasy viable options here. After a 2-game absence due to a hamstring injury, Darius Slayton will be active in week 8. This game is a rematch between the Giants and the Eagles, a game that we literally just saw 2 weeks ago. I talked about that matchup in my fantasy football storytime video and how results don't necessarily repeat in rematches just because teams adjust. But the biggest thing here for us is regarding Slayton is that he was not actually active in that first game. So unfortunately, we only have 1 reference point for his usage after Malik Neighbors' injury. That was week 5, when Slayton had just 3 receptions on 6 targets for 31 yards. But in his defense, none of the receivers were particularly effective in that matchup. It was a weird one where Theo Johnson and Cam Scadaboo were Jackson Dart's primary targets. We haven't seen anything from Slayton that really warrants starting him this week, but knowing that the Giants really need another receiver to step up, we are stashing Slayton just in case he pulls through this week. We talked about Colston Loveland in the regular waiver wire video earlier this week in anticipation of Kmet being out. Now Kmet has been ruled out and Loveland will get the start. Now, Loveland taking a backseat to Kmet is no indication of him not being up to the job. You have to remember that they literally had just paid Kmet a hefty contract, and he is no slouch. And it's not surprising that Loveland wasn't used much early on because he had also been dealing with an injury in the offseason as well, so that limited his preparation time. And this just wasn't an ideal situation to be drafted into in terms of providing heavy production in your rookie season. But now is the perfect time for him to shine. It is the perfect opportunity against a struggling Baltimore defense. If there is any matchup for Loveland to go off, it is this one right here. And here's the deal. There are 2 scenarios that could happen if he has a great game, and this is why we want to get ahead and go ahead and stash him. Scenario number 1 is that he has such a great game that Ben Johnson just pushes his snaps permanently above Kmet. And even when Kmet is healthy, you've got him and he's the starting tight end and you didn't have to spend on him. Scenario number 2 is that he has a great game, but Ben Johnson really doesn't care and he just continues to split snaps ineffectively with Kmet. And in that scenario, you may have to end up moving on for him, but it's not a big deal because you got him for free. You didn't blow all your FAAB grabbing him after a big game like everyone else. This one is pretty straightforward. We're stashing Christian Watson because we know he has had success in the past and he's a streaky player who can get hot and go on a run. I prefer to stash him rather than spending any FAAB or waiver wire priority on him. Because at this point, we have ample evidence that the Packers offense can be incredibly frustrating for all receivers from a fantasy perspective because Matt LaFleur simply refuses to commit to a true wide receiver 1. Now, to be fair, there are multiple candidates who could fill that role, so maybe that's part of the reasoning, but his decisions are not our concern. It is what it is, and we have to approach it. We have to approach it from a perspective by not overcommitting and staying very cautious with these receivers. At some point, we will get Jayden Reed back, but we have to remember that he was initially given an 8-week timeline for his broken collarbone, and I do not believe that that timeline was updated after he also underwent foot surgery as well for the injury that he had been playing through. So while the offense will eventually get crowded, in the meantime, Christian Watson is worth rostering and stashing in case he does play this week and has a solid game. We talked about this a couple of times. Chimere Dike has just as much potential as Aiyuk in this Tennessee offense. It's just the fact that the Tennessee offense overall has very little potential at this point. DK was actually drafted ahead of Aiyuk, but Aiyuk has the standalone starter role, and DK's contributions were mainly on special teams, and it seems like his snaps might have been held back a little bit by the presence of Tyler Lockett, but we've seen an increased usage of him over each week here, and now we have Tyler Lockett gone, so this is an excellent spot for DK to maybe have a permanent breakthrough, especially with Calvin Ridley out. Week 7 was a breakout game for him with 4 receptions on 4 targets for 70 yards and a touchdown. He is an excellent deep league stash, and if he has another strong performance in Week 8, you will be glad you took a chance. We talked about Troy Franklin and Marvin Mims in my waiver wire video and the start sit video, so I will not be too long on this one. If you want deeper information, go check out the start sit video. I prioritize Franklin between the two because he has been second behind Courtland Sutton in targets and snaps. We have seen a ceiling game from him in week 2 versus Indianapolis, where he had 8 receptions on 9 targets for 89 yards and a touchdown. And Franklin's only 2 bad performances were in games where Bo Nix threw for less than 200 yards, so we know the production is directly tied to Bo Nix's volume. That makes him an excellent candidate to have a big Week 8 performance because this matchup against Dallas just screams volume. Now with Marvin Mims, while I do have him slightly lower ranked than Franklin this week, they both have an excellent chance to go off in this matchup. The main difference here between Mims and Franklin is that Mims has a lower floor and he is a higher risk player because a lot of his production can be a little bit gimmicky. Still, he is just as fine of a stash as Franklin, especially if this offense gets hot in the back half of the season. Darnell Mooney is a little higher roster than I typically like to include in my stash videos, but I think it is still worth highlighting because there are very good odds that he finally has one of those signature Darnell Mooney games and is a big priority add this week. Mooney's 2025 has been underwhelming after an excellent 2024 season where he had nearly 1,000 yards and 5 touchdowns opposite of Drake London. Unfortunately, quite literally all of that production was with Kirk Cousins, and we simply haven't seen a strong connection form with him and Michael Penix. But if they're going to get together, this is the matchup to do it against Miami. Mooney is a strong stash because we know he has extreme upside. If he and Penix can get on the same page, Mooney would be a weekly flex option. And finally, check your waivers because people are getting desperate and dropping injured players. Quite frankly, check your waivers just in general because I have heard some crazy, absolutely crazy drops going on right now. But if Brandon Aiyuk is on waivers, it is the time to add him. Kyle Shanahan said they are planning to open up Aiyuk's practice window next week, which means he is 3 weeks or less away from returning. That is big because we knew he was close, but we didn't really have an exact timeline. Now, there has been no consistency in the 49ers receiving core at this point with all of the injuries. And while I am skeptical that Aiyuk will come back to a big workload immediately, his game has been reliant on touchdown equity rather than volume, so he doesn't really have to be on the field 100% of the time to be a startable option. Thank you so much for tuning in. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to like the video and subscribe to my channel. You can also find me across all social media platforms at It's Tara Time, so make sure that you are tuned in, subscribe, turn on notifications because I'm bringing you more fantasy football content all season long. Every week I've got you covered with top waiver wire ads, live shows, live Q&A where you can ask me any questions that you have, and so much more.